is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
You want answers!
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
We're telling you the truth.
And the truth shall set you free!
Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
Welcome, Bruchim Abiyim. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You have found Beit Virtuali, and let's stir up a little Torah together. There is a cynical way that I could instantly get more subscribers, views, likes, and most likely a heck of a lot more dislikes. I could visibly choose a side. Now, before anyone with strong views on this or that gets too up in arms, when I said cynical, I meant cynical for me. Cynical when taken against my most authentic self. A lot of you that regularly watch this channel have incredibly strong ideas and beliefs that may even contradict mine. Yay! Part of what makes this work is the collective agreement on this channel of machloket l'shem hashamayim, argument for the sake of heaven. We are obligated in our tradition to argue, and through this, we elevate each other. And since the word argument does make many uncomfortable, this of course also presupposes the inherent respect through which such arguments flow, as that elevation part of the whole thing doesn't do well with your average nuanced 4-word social media burn/reply. We argue for the sake of heaven, while we simultaneously attempt to do this in such a way that we are creating more heaven on earth than manifesting hell. In the current century, this is admittedly a challenge. This difficulty, however, does not remove the underlying obligation or the universal ethic behind it. The underlying ethic of this channel, as well as each of the pulpits that I've held, focuses on reaching deep into Jewish tradition in order to pull it into today, rather than reaching deep into today and pushing it into Jewish tradition. This is not a polemic statement. I have beloved colleagues that disagree with this approach, and the ones whose disagreement is expressed l'shem hashamayim, for the sake of heaven, remain dear colleagues. There are valid and powerful reasons to lead with the current headline from the pulpit, and the fact that I prefer the headline to come unbidden to each individual after exploring the archetypal wisdom inherent in Torah texts simply makes my approach a little antiquated. I'm going to go ahead and call it like fine wine, but I, of course, am prejudiced. It's my approach. That's my truth. The reason this is critical now, a few decades into the 21st century, should be obvious. The end of the Mayan calendar in 2012 did not bring about the dramatic apocalypse that Hollywood so wanted.
It's starting.
You sure you don't want to come with, man?
So beautiful, I'm gonna stay.
But it was the year that what I like to call Moloch the algorithm went online and started feeding us a steady diet of the most addicting and angering information possible in order to keep us in a never-ending doom scroll, occasionally punctuated by work, sleep, and the odd moment or two for a relationship. And yes, as this is being viewed where it's being viewed, I fully am aware of this irony. The funny thing about Moloch is parallel to the funny thing about ethics. The central Jewish ethical statement that we should do nothing to another that we ourselves would find reprehensible if done to us exists in one way or another, in one statement or another, in basically every religion, East or West, and is pretty much universally agreed upon as critical, and yet falls apart in practice for every one of us as soon as our ideology du jour helps us out with an excuse to not follow that. You know, I'd never want that done to me, but they deserve it. We all agree on the base ethical statement, and if we all acted like this, many problems would disappear. Yet, we don't act like this and are experts at justifying our behaviors. So it is with Moloch. By this point, only those most deeply buried in sand do not know about the algorithm and understand how destructive it is to us as individuals, as communities, and as a world. And yet, if you are, for example, watching this in the evening time, how many hours have you spent scrolling through your favorite feed today? Now, add on to that answer the last time we told someone else about how dangerous their social media use was. Anyone? Bueller? We are the people, like it or not, that can know, understand, and even be deeply informed about the dangers of something and still wholeheartedly use that something without moderation or modification. See, we are complex beings. There are several reasons that I refuse to associate from the Bima with one political side or another on anything that is a tribal debate. Whether we are talking about a write, film, or say from a pulpit, those reading, watching, or listening will be distributed on both sides of that tribal divide. The question is, and this is a serious question that I've asked over and over again, am I a rabbi for all that are present, or just the ones that agree with my inner political attitudes? If I feel even tribal divide strongly about something that is in opposition to a certain number of the congregation, which is inevitable, do I have a better chance of influencing them to what I believe is right by making a strong stance and putting them on the defensive, or by teaching from the universal archetypes of Torah and trusting that generational truths will do the job for me? I know that I have beloved colleagues that believe not taking a public stand is morally unforgivable. I've been told this quite pointedly. I also know of colleagues that fall more into my approach. Both have legitimate arguments, and these arguments are made by good and sincere people on both sides. Like it or not, there are two truths in the same room. How do we deal with this? There's a dramatic episode in the Torah that demonstrates this beautifully. Multiple people looking directly at the same evidence and coming up with different answers that will affect us differently. Now, before any claim is made that I'm a pure relativist by making such a statement, I do believe there is objective truth. I just believe even more strongly that any of us that claim to have absolute and undeniable knowledge of what that is should perhaps be careful. I will go ahead and take the risk of making black and white statements on things such as, there is no way either the earth is less than 10,000 years old or that any part of the Torah is there to make that claim. But I will be, radically on the other side of the scale, much more careful in a claim such as, I know what your motivation was for doing that thing that you just did. I can observe what you've done. My observations may even have some objectivity, depending on how much your actions affect me or those around me. But if I take it further, if I say I know, I'm on dangerous ground. I cannot have, under any circumstances, what we call epistemological certainty of your motivations. It is simply not possible. Now, notice how much territory there is between the strong statement I'm willing to make and the one that I'll avoid, at least out loud. And then add two observers to your actions that know you equally well or poorly and are as equally trained in observing human behavior. What happens when both of them come to different conclusions regarding your motivations and both state, I know? The Torah episode from Parashat Shelach is the first telling of the incident of the 12 spies. This story is critical in the surface narrative, as the amazing drama of what happens is required for us to understand the punishment that's required of the Jewish people to wander 40 years in the desert before being able to make a play for the land of their ancestors. The story is critical at an allegorical level, as it shows, especially in the age of Moloch the algorithm, how easily it is to be swayed by the most frightening vision presented to us, and then how we pass on that highly charged fear to others and cause society to be damaged rather than engage in elevation. The story is critical at a spiritual level because when we believe we have left behind something that has kept us in bondage or to which we're addicted, we will inevitably enter points of crisis. And even if we have a clear vision of where we want to end up, our promised land, it takes a long time for the parts of us that still long for our chains before we can step into the more terrifying but necessary space of freedom, the truth of the promised land as opposed to the fantasy of it. See, there's three truths in the same room right there. Welcome to Torah. The story itself behind these critical truths sees representatives from each of the 12 Hebrew tribes reconnoitering the land of Canaan. They observe armed soldiers and fortified towns, along with the land being good and able to grow stuff, yet come back with two quite different interpretations of what they see. For Caleb, it's, we can do it time. For the other 11, it's, nope, they are much stronger, followed by, when pushed probably by Caleb's contradictory perspective and the possibility that he might get his way, the country that we traversed and scouted is one that devours its settlers. All the people that we saw in it are of giant size. That apparently isn't enough, so mythology from the way past gets thrown in on top of a little Mark Twain-style hyperbole.
We saw the Nephilim there, and we looked like grasshoppers to ourselves, and so we must have looked to them.
Like grasshoppers, that is. Now, ignoring for a moment that some of this can be directly paralleled to many of the various moral panics that I've encountered in my half-century, what do we make of this mad descent into reductio ad absurdum? When encountering Shelach, my usual sermon focuses on the moral panic of this. We react instead of engaging and educating. Left, right, center, what keeps us online are the catastrophic statements. And this was just as true of the 6 o'clock news and If It Bleeds, It Leads before the internet, and William Randolph Hearst's sensationalism before that. His famous quote can easily be updated for today. If you don't read your newsfeed, you are uninformed. If you do, you are misinformed. What a quandary we are in. What a quandary we have been in. We tend to hysteria because we are evolutionarily programmed to need to quickly react when someone in our cave or on the savannah calls out danger. As we added more complexity to our brains, we added the capacity to use this instinct in others cynically.
Our paralyzing, crippling, record-breaking storm comes today!
Worse, we pretty much all know it exists, and yes, choose to read the feed and get angry anyway, followed by reading the responses from bots and get angrier, even while knowing how prevalent bots are. Welcome to the clash of a humanity optimized through evolution for life in extended family groups of less than 150 people, and the one interconnected via amoral algorithms to more than 8 billion. Still, seeing and calling out only the moral panic aspect of this story misses something else. Compassion. It's really easy to mock the other 11 spies' hyperbole. Look what I did to their voice. Until we do even the most minimum of work to put ourselves in their shoes. How comfortable, for example, did most of us feel the first time we left our comfort zone home and visited a completely foreign culture? I personally, for another example, may have not understood the size thing. They look like giants, had I not spent an afternoon with a retired NBA center. Todd McCulloch, a total mensch, by the way, is 7 feet tall, 2.13 meters. I am, well, okay, not that tall. So saying I felt like a grasshopper may not really describe how I in the first seconds interpreted the size difference. It's a completely different sermon for a different day to point out how his being a mensch nearly immediately negated this, yet how would the perception have lasted had he not been? When we are in positions of discomfort, differences are elevated. They're heightened. Now add to this the surface meaning of the story. These 12 men were not just spies. They would have been the vanguard to the Jewish militia entering the land of Canaan. Remember, our ancestors are a few months out of servitude in Egypt. I'm imagining that their spears weren't exactly bright and shiny acquisitions from the military-industrial complex of the day. That honor would have gone to the soldiers that would have been defending against them from behind fortified walled cities. Now, you are one of the 12. In complete honesty, who are you siding with? We can do it, Caleb? Are you kidding me? Now, the way the story moves and ends with punishment for the panic comes from the larger narrative perspective of the story. If you live according to the law set down by the Eternal, what are you worried about? Don't you remember the parting of the sea? Fine. But I also read the rest of the books of the Tanakh, and guess what? Caleb wasn't right. The book of Joshua can essentially be read as the book of failures of the conquest of Canaan. Yes, some tribes in the narrative did their job. Others, as the text very pointedly explains, did not. Could not, which becomes the jumping off point for the rest of the Tanakh narrative. You did not do what you were supposed to do, so you were surrounded by people who worshipped other gods and influenced you to do the same. Everything bad that happens to you, it comes from that. See, I think the punishment is not so much for the moral panic as it was for the situation arising in the first place. In Judaism, we have a non-joke joke of 1 Torah, 2 rabbis, 3 opinions. Now we have 12 spies, even ignoring the typology of 12 meaning the full picture of all personality possibilities. What sane one of us in the camp assumed all 12 were going to agree? What we really have is a series of organizational failures. Did the 12 spies not talk to each other when they were out there? Did Caleb stay silent as the others were saying this is bad, and think that by speaking first when they got back, he would have the ability to sway the crowd and force the other 11 into compliance? I've seen that technique in board meetings and project meetings, but it never works very well. These 12 men were chosen as tribal representatives, leaders, if you will, and none of them, including Caleb, actually showed leadership. At least if the purpose of leadership is to elevate. The events, when they returned, shows that they did nothing along the way to discuss and elevate their argument before it came before the crowd, whether out of ignorance or on purpose. Either way, a failure of leaders. Then we have the failure of Moses, Aaron, and the elders. Did they think all 12 would speak as one tally-ho voice? Were there not also multiple perspectives and parties and hopes and fears back in the camp? Had they not all been around from the first time we grumbled at lack of direction, saying we would have been better off in Egypt? Which organization prepares for a completely potential problematic report without discussing beforehand the various possibilities and implications? 12 different perspectives set into the unknown has a 100% probability of returning 12 separate observations that turn into 12 different personal truths tied to personal ego. For each individual, their perspective was an absolute truth, regardless of the contradictory perspective of another. Add the life and death danger aspect and you have a mess with no mitigation attempts. And if I speak like a corporate consultant and this feels inappropriate for the Torah narrative, go back and see how much of the Tanakh deals very directly with leadership styles, failures, and consequences. It's everywhere, and there's no way those responsible for the final Torah manuscript would be unaware of the place of organizational failure in this story. Earlier, I asked the rhetorical question regarding what do we do when we have two truths in the same room? There is an answer today, and the answer is not we work it out. The answer has clearly become, well, we create a second room. Yet the heart of this archetypal story speaks to a truth that we have nearly forgotten. Multiple perspectives of something that is not objectively measurable will always leave us with multiple truths. And even if they're not true truths, the way that we as human functions will make them so in practice in that moment. And again, I'm not talking about giving equal time to flat earthers. There are boundaries. This is about acknowledging the destructive power of forgetting to build ourselves around the inevitability of being in the same room with someone with whom we disagree, even profoundly. I offer that the 40 years punishment is a result of institutional failure that ultimately resulted in an ensuing panic. Some of our human debates require the iterative scientific process. Anyone who says personal truths are the only appropriate measure of information deny this when they use their mobile phones. Every aspect of the technology and how the information that comes from the technology is transmitted depends on the underlying iterative process of hypothesis. Attempting to prove one's own hypothesis wrong, rehypothesizing, and only proceeding to the next step when the attempt to prove oneself wrong, not right, wrong, fails. This builds up over time to create a usable body of knowledge that can be applied by the practical engineering types that also need to know the load possible on a bridge made from this material over that length. None of us want a perspective, an emotional truth, to be an answer to that question as we're about to drive on that bridge. But outside of that world, the rest of the world is filled constantly by two truths in the same room. Sometimes these are friendly divisions, such as going to a Mariners stadium in my Phillies jersey. Some of them are not so friendly today, such as in Congress or Parliament, as real options are debated that affect real people with real needs, but where the solution isn't as obvious as calculating the angle of a curve on the highway. A society that functions is the one that starts with the understanding that two truths can exist in the same space, and that the holders of each truth may possibly both be good people, sincerely working for the betterment of all. And that if one happens to truly be wrong, that how we behave in that room will be the only thing that helps bring them into the truth. The obvious iterative question involves that second room. Right now, how many separate rooms have I created so that I don't have to debate Caleb?
I'm personally frightened at the prospect of marching on Jericho, aren't you? Caleb wants to take your moms and your babies. He's no longer welcome in this room, only those that are as afraid as I am in this moment.
Hey, what's great for Moloch is that Moloch is equally happy in both rooms. More happy, actually, as once we're in two rooms, we won't even be able to look at the same information like we did when we were together out in Canaan. That 40-year punishment, as everyone of all generations entered into the panic and were unable to find a place to exist in the same room, as we all, of all generations that are adults right now, are engaging in the same sort of thing. Isn't the 40-year punishment all of a sudden a little bit more fascinating and a little bit more immediate? How are we going to get through this? And how are we going to get back into the same room? Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you next time.
No v'kol zimra b'chatzot zerot v'kol shofar